She woke up every morning to the sound of birds outside her window, but something felt wrong today. The water from the tap looked strange, a murky brown that had never been there before. She ran her fingers under the stream. It felt heavy and thick, and a smell lingered that made her stomach twist. She knew something was wrong, and it was not going to go away if she stayed silent. She poured a glass and took a small sip and immediately felt a burning in her throat. It was not a taste she could ignore. She went outside to the neighbors and asked if they had noticed anything unusual. Some shrugged it off, some laughed, but a few had felt it too, a subtle unease that they could not explain. She felt a responsibility heavier than anything she had carried before. This was not just about her, this was about her community, her friends, her neighbors, the children who played in the parks, the elderly who drank from their taps without question. She could not let them be harmed. She went to the city offices and explained what she had seen. The officials smiled politely and said there was nothing to worry about. The water was tested regularly. Everything was fine. They told her she was overreacting. She left the building with a clenched jaw and a heart racing with anger. She knew she could not stop there. She began documenting everything, every discoloration, every complaint, every strange smell. She collected bottles of water from different homes and made a log. She recorded times and dates and called laboratories to test the samples. The results came back: shocking levels of contamination, dangerous chemicals that should never have been in the water at all. She was not a scientist, but the proof was undeniable. She went back to the city officials and showed them the reports. They looked at the papers with mild annoyance and said they were mistakes. They told her she was causing panic. She left feeling defeated, but not broken. She knew she had to find another way. She reached out to local news stations and social media. She told her story, and the data spoke for itself. The community began to pay attention. Her neighbors started to realize that this was not paranoia, this was reality. They rallied behind her. Signs appeared on lawns. People knocked on doors urging others to check their water. They organized meetings and town halls, and the city officials could no longer ignore the swelling voice of the people. She continued to speak out despite threats and pressure. She knew the stakes were high, but her courage was higher. She interviewed experts and scientists who confirmed her fears, and the city could not refute the evidence anymore. There were protests and marches, and eventually the officials admitted the contamination was real. The city promised to take action. The water was treated, new pipelines were installed, and the community was finally safe. She had done more than fight for clean water. She had inspired everyone around her to stand up and speak the truth. She had shown that one person could make a difference, that bravery was not about guns or battles, it was about persistence and caring deeply for others. She became a local hero, but she remained humble, knowing that the real victory was the safety of the town. She continued to monitor the water. She continued to advocate for transparency and accountability, and every time she turned on her tap, she smiled, knowing that her fight had not been in vain. She walked through the streets with a notebook in her hand. Every door she knocked on told a story of fear and uncertainty, of lives disrupted and health at risk. She spoke to parents whose children had fallen sick with rashes and stomach pains. She spoke to the elderly who remembered the water always being clear and now wondering how it could betray them. She listened to their stories and wrote them down. Every word fueled her determination. The nights were long and sleepless. She would stay up, checking emails, making calls, arranging meetings, and contacting experts from faraway cities who could lend credibility to her findings. Each day brought more resistance. The city officials sent letters warning her to stop spreading misinformation. They tried to intimidate her with legal threats, and officials at the water department refused to speak to her. They wanted her to go away, but she could not. She had seen the results. She had tasted the water. She had spoken to the families. She had seen the fear in their eyes, and she knew she could not retreat. She began organizing community testing events, setting up tables in parks and town squares where families could bring water samples from their homes, and she would help them test and record the results. The lines of people grew, and with them grew the realization that this was not an isolated problem. The contamination was widespread, and the collective voice of the community became impossible to ignore. She began to host informational meetings, inviting doctors, scientists, and environmental experts to speak to the townspeople, and the room would fill with hope and fear in equal measure. Hope that something could be done, fear of what might have already happened to the children and adults who had been drinking the water all along. She wrote letters to newspapers and local media pleading for coverage, sharing the data, the images of discolored water, the testimonies of families, and slowly the story began to gain traction. Reporters came to interview her, cameras rolled as she spoke passionately, and tears sometimes falling from her eyes. She told the truth as simply as she could. She told how one person could refuse to be silent. She told how bravery was quiet and steady persistence, not loud gestures. The officials tried to downplay it in the media, claiming the contamination levels were not dangerous. But she had the proof. The lab reports, the expert opinions, and the growing chorus of families who had fallen ill with symptoms that could not be ignored. They could not deny the truth forever. She organized marches down Main Street holding banners that read, "Clean water is a right." She walked at the front of the crowd, her steps firm and unyielding. The streets were lined with neighbors clapping and cheering her name. The police watched but did not intervene, and the news helicopters captured every moment. Her story spread to national outlets, and soon the city could feel the heat of public scrutiny. The officials called emergency meetings behind closed doors discussing how to contain the growing outrage. She remained outside, knocking on doors, speaking to residents, reassuring them and encouraging them to document everything. Nothing was too small, nothing too insignificant. Every piece of evidence mattered, every voice mattered. She met with environmental lawyers who explained the legal avenues she could take, and she did not hesitate to file complaints against the city, demanding immediate action, demanding transparency and accountability. She rallied volunteers to help with testing and distribution of clean water to families in need. The logistics were overwhelming, but she did not let fatigue or fear slow her down. Each day, she reminded herself that this was bigger than exhaustion. This was about lives. She spent nights at community centers, filling jugs with water, taking notes on every sample, organizing schedules for distribution, and still rising before dawn to continue the fight. Her home became a hub for meetings, calls, and strategy sessions. The walls lined with documents, photos of water samples, and letters from grateful families who had been given hope through her persistence. She faced moments of doubt when the city officials threatened lawsuits, when misinformation spread through social media, when some in the community began to question if her efforts were too extreme. But each time she looked at the faces of the children she had helped or read a letter from a sick neighbor, she remembered why she could not stop. The fire inside her heart could not be extinguished. She enlisted the help of scientists to conduct independent tests. The results were alarming. Levels of lead and chemicals far above safe thresholds. The findings were presented at a town hall meeting packed with residents, many crying, some shaking with fear and anger. She spoke to the crowd not as a hero, but as one of them, one who had seen the danger and refused to ignore it. She told them that together they had power, together they could demand change, together they could force the city to act, and they did. The city announced emergency measures to provide safe water and begin a cleanup and replacement of contaminated pipes. It was a monumental victory, and yet she knew the fight was not over. She continued to monitor the water, working with local officials and experts, ensuring that promises turned into action. She gave interviews explaining the importance of community vigilance and transparency, and slowly the town began to heal. The water became safe again, and the residents regained trust in their daily lives. She had done more than save water. She had saved her neighbors from complacency and fear, and she had shown that courage could come from quiet determination and endless compassion. She became a symbol of resilience and tenacity. Her story shared in schools and community centers, inspiring the next generation to speak up for what is Right, and never underestimate the power of one voice. She reminded everyone that bravery was not always visible. It could be measured in the long nights of research, the countless phone calls, the courage to stand alone when necessary, and the love for a community that refused to be ignored. And as she watched children fill their glasses with clear, clean water, she felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that the fight had been worth it, and that the town would never forget the woman who refused to stay silent. Even in the quiet moments when the house was empty and the streets were calm, she could not rest. Her mind raced with thoughts of what could have happened, what might still happen. She thought of the families who had suffered quietly for months, drinking water that should have been safe. She thought of the children who had complained of stomach aches and headaches, and how many more might have fallen ill without her intervention. She felt the weight of responsibility pressing down like a storm cloud. But she refused to be crushed by it. She reminded herself that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. She met with mothers who wept in her arms, sharing stories of illness and frustration, of city officials who ignored their pleas. She spoke to fathers who had tried to fight but felt powerless in the face of bureaucracy, and she listened to every word, committing it to memory, every testimony of fuel for her persistence. She spent hours on the phone with scientists, analyzing new samples, each result adding to the growing mountain of evidence. She coordinated with volunteers who mapped out the most affected neighborhoods, distributing clean water and educational pamphlets explaining the dangers and what to look for. She held workshops teaching residents how to test their own water and encourage them to keep records. She knew knowledge was power, and she wanted the community armed with it. The media coverage intensified. National outlets picked up the story, and reporters followed her daily, documenting her tireless work and the faces of grateful families. Soon the city officials could not dismiss her. They could not ignore the flood of evidence and public attention. They were forced to respond. They convened emergency meetings with engineers and water specialists and announced plans for immediate remediation. The town watched as crews worked day and night, replacing pipes, flushing contaminated water, and installing filtration systems. It was an enormous task, but one that could not have begun without her unwavering determination. She continued to walk the streets, speaking to residents, answering questions, calming fears, and ensuring the work was thorough and transparent. Every morning, she checked water samples, and every evening, she documented the results she created, a log that would later be used as proof in ensuring long-term safety. She collaborated with lawyers, drafting petitions and preparing for hearings. She met with city council members, challenging their assumptions and demanding accountability. She attended every public meeting and spoke with a voice steady but filled with emotion, sharing the reality of what had occurred and why complacency could no longer be tolerated. She inspired others to take action. Some neighbors began organizing community cleanups, some formed committees to monitor water quality, others volunteered to assist with distribution and documentation. The movement grew beyond her expectations. The unity and collective action of the town became a force that could not be ignored. She felt moments of exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm her, but each time she looked at the faces of those she had helped, she found renewed strength. The children who could now drink safely from their taps, the parents who could sleep at night without worry, the elderly who had regained a sense of trust in their community. All these small victories reminded her why the struggle was worth every sleepless night, every phone call, every confrontation with resistant officials. She became more than a voice for change. She became a symbol of what ordinary people could achieve when fear was replaced with determination and love for others. She held town hall meetings where residents shared their own stories, and slowly the narrative shifted from despair to hope, each story a testament to resilience and courage. She documented the journey meticulously, every sample, every letter, every testimony, every photo, capturing the emotional toll and the triumphs along the way. She made sure the story would be remembered not for her own glory, but as proof that vigilance and bravery could protect a community from harm. She trained volunteers to continue monitoring the water long after the immediate crisis passed, ensuring that the town would never again fall victim to negligence. She worked with environmental scientists to implement long-term safety measures and educational programs in schools, teaching children about water safety and environmental stewardship. The town began to heal and trust was slowly rebuilt. The victory was not just clean water, but a renewed sense of community and collective responsibility. She had sparked a movement that went beyond the boundaries of her small town. The national attention inspired other communities to examine their own water sources and demand accountability from local authorities. She had shown that one person with courage and persistence could ignite change that rippled far beyond what seemed possible. She watched as the last contaminated pipes were replaced and the water ran crystal clear from every faucet. The joy and relief in the faces of residents brought tears to her eyes. She felt a deep sense of fulfillment knowing that her efforts had not been in vain, but she also knew that the fight for safety and justice was ongoing, that vigilance was a daily responsibility. She continued her work quietly yet passionately, ensuring that transparency and accountability would remain the standard. Her story became part of local history taught in schools and shared at community centers, inspiring generations to come. She had proven that bravery could take many forms, that it could be found in persistence, in compassion, in the refusal to accept the status quo. She became a quiet hero, a guardian of her community, a living testament to what could be achieved when one person refused to turn away. She would always remember the nights of fear, the moments of doubt, the relentless pursuit of truth, but more importantly, she would remember the faces of those she helped and the knowledge that her courage had made a tangible difference in the lives of countless people. The days became longer and heavier as the fight continued. She woke before sunrise and returned home long after dark. Her body ached from exhaustion. Her mind was a whirlwind of tests, meetings, phone calls, and planning, yet she never let the fatigue show. She had learned that courage was not always visible. It could be measured in the quiet moments of endurance, in the persistence to keep going even when the odds seemed insurmountable. She missed family gatherings and social events. She turned down invitations and abandoned small comforts, knowing that the work she was doing mattered far more than personal convenience. She felt the strain of loneliness, sometimes the weight of being the only one standing against powerful officials, and entrenched bureaucracy threatened to crush her spirit, but she found solace in small victories: the smile of a child drinking clean water, the grateful handshake of a neighbor who had finally found relief, the words of thanks from a mother who no longer feared for her family. Each one reminded her why she could not stop. She faced relentless criticism from skeptics and people who did not understand the depth of the danger. Some accused her of overreacting, others said she was seeking attention, but she ignored them. She focused only on the facts, on the evidence, on the people who were counting on her. She held a major public hearing where city officials were forced to answer to the community. The room was packed, the tension palpable. She stood at the podium, presenting her meticulous documentation, the lab reports, the testimonies of affected families, the clear evidence of contamination. Her voice steady yet filled with emotion as she spoke of the lives at risk and the failures of the system. The officials shifted uncomfortably. Some avoided her gaze, others whispered among themselves. But the weight of truth was undeniable. The media captured every moment, the cameras rolling on her determination, and the crowd's reaction. The residents cheered and applauded, showing support in unison, a tidal wave of community unity that could not be ignored. The officials finally made public commitments to replace all contaminated infrastructure, to provide safe water to every household, and to implement ongoing monitoring and transparency measures. It was a historic moment, a turning point that would ensure the town's safety for generations. The work was far from over, but the path forward was clear. She oversaw the distribution of clean water to all affected families, coordinated with engineers and scientists to monitor progress, and ensured that every promise was tracked and fulfilled. She spoke at schools, sharing her story, inspiring young minds to understand the importance of courage, responsibility, and advocacy. She trained volunteers to continue monitoring the water long after the immediate crisis passed, creating a legacy of vigilance and community action. The town began to heal and trust slowly returned to the daily routines of life. The sound of children playing in the parks no longer accompanied worry. The water ran clear in every home, and the town had learned a lesson in the power of persistence and the importance of speaking truth to authority. She had shown that bravery could be quiet yet unstoppable, that one person's determination could ignite an entire community into action. She reflected on the journey, the fear, the exhaustion, the moments of doubt, but also the moments of triumph, the hugs of gratitude, the first safe sip of water in months, the sense of relief washing over families. She had fought not for recognition, but for justice and safety for others, and that made every sacrifice worthwhile. She had become a symbol of resilience, a